Coming up.
The Prime Minister did not release these information to the Canadian public, but it was released in the Washington Post, correct?
This is quite literally the plot of several Bollywood movies.
You mentioned that in February 2024, the RCMP created a multidisciplinary team to investigate and coordinate efforts to combat this threat. Who initiated that multidisciplinary team, and who were the members of it? In that, were they beyond the RCMP? Did they include members at this table today, for example?
Pierre Poilievre is not doing the responsible thing to take the clearance.
Is it folks at this table, or who other outside the RCMP was engaged in this at that time?
In the case of Amandeep Singh, who has been accused of killing Mr. Najjar, were you aware that Amandeep Singh was on bail?
The question about the Indian government potentially, and my colleague Mr. Gahir spoke about the reference to a Bollywood plot.
The reason we are here is because he has failed to maintain national security. The reason we have the national inquiry into foreign interference is because there's been a failure to maintain the integrity of our democracy in terms of its attacks from China and the confidence that creates, the confidence issue that creates across Canada.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
The committee commences its study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada from agents of the Government of India. I would now like to welcome our witnesses today. From the Privy Council Office, we have Nathalie Durand, Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council Office and National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. From the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, we have Daniel Rogers, Director. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, David Morrison, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Tricia Geddes, Associate Deputy Minister. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Michael Duhem, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here to discuss this very serious development. Certainly, in the RCMP Commissioner, in your own words, are an unprecedented announcement that you and others had made on October 14th, and you had said that the violence orchestrated by India has become, quote, a significant threat to public safety in Canada, with well over a dozen credible and imminent threats to life. And Commissioner Duhem, on October 14th, you said that you had clear evidence that links officials from the Government of India to violent crimes in Canada, but you provided no further details at that time, and you said that you needed to protect the open investigations and court proceedings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, you were of the opinion that those details, if released, could jeopardize the investigation into the murders and other violent acts by India on Canadians and people residing in Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, and I also comment on the evidence that was presented by Deputy Commissioner Flynn in Singapore with Madame Dewey and Mr. Morrison on the schemes or the modus operandi of how the Government of India operates.
And Mr. Durand already mentioned this a bit, but you are aware, of course, of the Washington Post article from that same day on October 14th that includes details of this sensitive information that you had chosen not to share because you felt that it would jeopardize the investigation. Is that correct?
Just for clarity, there's a difference with sensitive information under national security chapeau, but this was the information that's in the article. It was more or less some information from the investigations that we're doing.
So you don't feel that the information in the Washington Post, that those details were sensitive in any way?
Not sensitive to national security as it's portrayed as national security sensitive information. It's information part of investigation, which normally we would like to keep within, but sometimes we do release some information.
So normally you would have kept those details private, but they're of course not private anymore.
I would say on occasion we have come up with some information to stimulate certain things when we're investigating. But this one here, again, is not sensitive, as I mentioned, under the national security definition.
Commissioner, why did you choose not to release the information during your press conference that was at the same time released by the Washington Post? Why were those details kept from the public in Canada?
Because I didn't think at that point it was relevant, that specific information. And again, I wasn't part of the conversation with the Washington Post.
And Mr. Durand, you were part of that conversation with the Washington Post, is that correct?
Correct.
Correct, and you felt that those details were not sensitive and would not jeopardize any investigation?
So maybe I can share two things. So the information we shared with the journalists over there were not classified. I would like also, and the job of journalists may be better than I do, but journalists have also separate sources. That's something that has to be said. As I said also in my opening remarks, this is someone who has followed India stories many times. And the information that was disclosed in the Washington Post, I think, are also available elsewhere.
You can confirm then that the information about, for example, the Indian Home Affairs Minister and his alleged involvement in these crimes in Canada, that was not released in Canada, however. Can you confirm that? That was only released in the Washington Post, pardon me.
So this is not an information we provided to the journalists.
Pardon me, it was not information you provided?
No.
Who provided that information then to the journalist? You're not sure? But that was not yourself who provided that information, was it?
We did not.
Mr. Morrison, can you comment? Did you provide that information?
The journalist called me and asked me if it was that person. I confirmed it was that person.
Oh, you confirmed. So you
This is a journalist who's written extensively on this topic. A journalist that has various sources. He asked me if that was one of the people, and I confirmed that it was.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. In that day, you can confirm, both Mr. Drin and Mr. Morrison, that the Prime Minister did not release these information to the Canadian public, but it was released in the Washington Post, correct?
Released in the Washington Post, yes. I'm just racking my memory for exactly what the Prime Minister said.
Mr. Ray, you advise the Prime Minister on issues of national security and intelligence, correct? You're the top advisor in Canada, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you advise him not to release that information publicly in Canada?
So we worked with the Prime Minister and the different ministers in terms of their public statements, and I think this is what I can say. Like we advised and we review what was going to be the Q&As and the public statement by the Prime Minister and the different ministers.
I'm trying to understand why it is the Washington Post received information when the Deputy Commissioner, the Commissioner, the Prime Minister, the Public Safety Minister, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs did not provide that information to Canada. And in fact, Canadians wouldn't know unless they were able to read the Washington Post. I just find that quite unfair to the Canadian public that details were released in advance to the Washington Post and confirmed, according to Mr. Morrison, to the Washington Post, but not provided to Canada. Don't you find that odd?
The reason why we offered, as I said in my opening remarks, a background interview to the Washington Post was really to make sure that our side of the story will become clearly and be widely spread, especially at the international level. That was the strategy behind the background interview we gave.
Thank you. Sancho? We go now to Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Nguyen, my first question is for you. A criminal that is jailed in a foreign jail in India that acts on behest of the Indian government for basic immunity to carry out his operations. This is quite literally the plot of several Bollywood movies that I've watched growing up, and it's funny to see that the Indian government takes its hints from Bollywood. My question to you is, this is an individual that's being kept in an Indian jail. There's potential involvement of Indian ministers and diplomats. How far does our jurisdiction reach? What action can be taken against a Lawrence Bishnoi type figure if the evidence actually shows that there is a connection all the way through?
Do you want to have a crack at this? Your question is a very interesting one in terms of the jurisdiction we may have when it comes to law enforcement elsewhere in the world. And this is why, as I presented in my opening remarks, the cooperation mechanism and for India to take accountability and to direct Bishnoi to stop its illegal criminal activities in Canada was essential. And this is why also we wanted to use all the tools available to us, including diplomatic tools. But maybe Commissioner, you want to add to
I
that?
could probably add some to that, and I just want to mention that we still have significant ongoing files right now. So to your question, if the evidence supports the involvement of an individual overseas, there's always that possibility to lay charges on Canadian soil. Then you get into the extradition process and whatnot, and if the individual's locked up for the next, I don't know how long he's locked up, that could be challenging, but doesn't mean that we have to recuse ourselves from laying any criminal charges against the individual.
We go now to Ms. Dancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wright, you are the National Security Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, so you take direction from him, and do you take direction from anyone else in his office, his Chief of Staff, for example?
No.
Only from the Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister authorize you to leak this information to the Washington Post?
The Prime Minister did not direct us in terms of the media strategy. That was a strategy that we developed at the civil servant level. PMO and other MOs were aware of that mitigating strategy if India wished to not collaborate with us, but Prime Minister did not direct us to do it, nor they approve what was going to be shared with the Washington Post.
As you said, they were aware that you were about to do it. Is that correct?
The old strategy has been shared with the Prime Minister and his office.
Including leaking the information to the Washington
We did not leak information to the Washington Post.
My apologies, providing sensitive information to the Washington Post that you did not provide publicly to anyone else.
We did not provide any classified information to the Washington Post.
Sensitive intelligence was provided to the Washington Post that was not provided to Canadian journalists, correct?
So the conversation we had with the Washington Post, I think I have explained already what was the purpose of that, and the parameter of the conversation has been discussed amongst ourselves.
I appreciate that. It would seem like a leak because it wasn't provided to Canadian journalists. It wasn't provided to the Canadian public. In fact, the Canadian public would not be aware unless they read the Washington Post and subsequent Canadian reporting on what was included in the Washington Post. And from my perspective, that certainly seems like a leak, and it certainly is concerning that was done without knowledge of Canadian officials who are reporting on this, Mr. Rand, but I appreciate your perspective on that. To the Commissioner...
J'aimerais donner l'occasion à mon collègue.
I'd like to give my colleague an opportunity to answer.
The same issue.
Sure.
Within our strategy, we were talking to different audiences. And so we deliberately chose, as Madame Drouin said in her introductory remarks, a credible, internationally read newspaper that would carry our side of the story. We chose a journalist who had a long record of background in this particular issue. He had written on it a number of times before. And through the Washington Post, we were speaking directly to our friends in the United States. We were speaking to our allies in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. And we were also speaking directly to Indians.
Mr. Morrison, just on that then, the leak or the non-leak was an effort to get the Americans on board for the Canadian perspective. Was it an effort then, in other words, to have American elected officials, those in the President's office, for example, read the Washington Post and be further compelled to back up Canada in this regard? Was that sort of, in other words, in plain language, is that what the objective was?
What I would say is that we approached this whole series of events, including our approach that we adopted in going to Singapore. We were talking to our closest allies who share similar concerns from the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Minister. To the Commissioner, just in your original press release, you'd mentioned that in February 2024, the RCMP created a multidisciplinary team to investigate and coordinate efforts to combat this threat. Who initiated that multidisciplinary team, and who were the members of it? In that, were they beyond the RCMP? Did they include members at this table today, for example?
We did initiate it. There's two teams that we initiated. One with all the extortions and harassment that we're seeing predominantly in Alberta, Vancouver, as well as in Toronto general area. We had a coordination team out of BC that was looking after that, but we also felt the need to put a team together to look at violent extremists and foreign interference, which involves several government departments that are part of this task force.
Who initiated that?
I believe that Deputy Commissioner Flynn initiated that.
Okay, so it was not direction from anyone at this table or anyone
No,
from the Prime
no.
Minister's office
No.
to engage in. Was that team central to the subsequent events that we heard over Thanksgiving?
I would say that team, there was already independent investigations going on before this team was created. This was more to bring a whole government approach as what we're seeing from the intelligence-wise from the criminal side.
To my final seconds here. So this was the first time that a whole of government approach was taken, was February 2024.
At this size, yes. But other than that, there's daily work with the service and other government departments on a ad hoc basis when required.
Mr. Rogers earlier mentioned that TRM will not do the whole thing, the clearance. And what I'm hearing on the ground is that Mr. Pierre Poilievre is not doing the responsible thing to take the clearance. And not only that, we have heard extensive calls, for the Conservative leader of the opposition to do responsible thing and get his clearance. Can you explain to this committee why it would be the responsible thing to do for Mr. Pierre Poilievre to get the clearance? Mr. Rogers. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think I would just say that the responsibility of the service is to do everything that it can to protect public safety and to reduce the threat of foreign interference from India in Canada. From our perspective, if a leader chooses to take a clearance, we will provide the information that I spoke to earlier, and that we would do everything we could to enable that information to be provided to make the best decisions in the interests of Canadians within that party. If a leader chooses not to get a clearance, then we will continue to evaluate other mechanisms available to us to help to reduce that threat. That can include threat reduction measures or others. If a leader chooses to have a clearance, we can have a broader conversation with them about the details of the threat and certain types of intelligence.
We go now back to Ms. Stancho. Ms. Stancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, again, on the February 2024 that you created this multidisciplinary team, who you said that it sort of brought people together to work on this issue. Is it folks at this table, or who other outside the RCMP was engaged in this at that time?
So you would have some of the normal partners that we have: CSIS, CSC, CBSA, FinTrack, RCC, RCMP, multiple sections within the RCMP, and obviously police jurisdiction when we look at the extortion cases in Alberta, Toronto, and BC.
Global affairs included in that?
I don't think so. This was more on a, well, I do have others where DOJ and GAC, but most of it is all the, I'd say the practitioners when it comes to law enforcement or security mandate.
Okay, it's my understanding from this testimony and others that it was about 8 weeks before this announcement on October 14th that the RCMP sort of came together with the other officials at this table. Is that correct?
No, in the sense that Madame Drouin did say, or Mr. Morrison said, about 8 weeks when we started planning on the diplomatic side. But there have been regular briefings as to just to inform the speed and flow of the investigation.
Mr. Drouin had mentioned there were diplomatic outreach to India in November 2023. That was the first of this event. Is that correct, Mr. Drouin? Can you just correct me? You had said it in your opening statement.
So back then in August 2023, it is important to remember that we were talking about the Niger murder, while what we have talked about since Thanksgiving is a broader set of violences in Canada. But regarding the Niger murder, we have started our diplomatic outreach with India in August 2023, so prior to the Prime Minister's statement. And as I testified, we had many other meetings with them.
Did you have other conversations with the Prime Minister following his statement in the House of Commons on September 18th between then and in the few weeks leading up to October 14th of this year?
The Commissioner said, Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner offered, and I said that also in my opening remarks, several updates on this file to the Prime Minister and myself over the last year.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand, we had this unprecedented event where the Prime Minister stood in the House of Commons and made this quite extraordinary claim that India was responsible for the murder of, Canadian. And then 11 months later, on October 14th, 2024, we see that there was quite a phenomenal escalation of the concern to those in Canada and Canadian citizens and others from India. So from an outsider perspective, there was that statement made in the House of Commons, and things got extraordinarily worse despite the number of efforts you have outlined that you have made in that time. I'm trying to understand where the failure was to stop this. Perhaps you can shed some light on that, Ms. Duran. Why were all these efforts that you've said that you've done, why were they not successful? It got to a point where 13 individuals were in peril 11 months later.
Le commissionnaire l'a dit, et je le...
The commissioner said it, and I repeat, for many years now, there have been investigations about violence against Canadians of Indian origin on Canadian soil. One of the reasons, and you're completely right in saying that violence has escalated, unfortunately, after August 2023, and it's precisely that escalation of violence that led the RCMP to having talks with Global Affairs Canada so that we can look at the use of all available tools to put a stop to that network of violence. And the first thing that needed to be done was to make this network of data collection impossible.
By concluding a few moments, it seems like it took prompting from the RCMP for Global Affairs and yourself to really insist on this quite unprecedented diplomatic action to expel 6 diplomats. Why did it take the RCMP sort of initiating those conversations to get it to such a point?
Une chose que je pourrais rajouter.
One thing I could add is that in 2023, we worked on the basis of intelligence, credible intelligence on the involvement of India in Nijar's murder. What we've been talking about publicly in the past 2 weeks is the result of serious investigations. So I think it's important to make that distinction. It's the very hard work of multidisciplinary teams led by the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner that allowed us to shed light on this stratagem. There's the ones who realized that investigations were to continue, but while they continued, we had to take the action necessary to put an end to this network of violence.
My first question is to you, Mr. Dumais, or Mr. Rogers can answer. Have you seen evidence of any other democratic country that has gathered information on Canadians, passed it up to its capital, then given the information to organized crime to conduct such heinous crimes as murder, extortion, and shootings in Canada?
Mr. Chair, I will limit my comments to, we do have ongoing foreign interference investigations, so in considering that they're ongoing, I'm not going to comment on that. But going back to the India side, we did see the indictment of 2 Indians in India on a planned murder on a U.S. citizen, so that dictates that other countries are probably going through what we're going through with the same modus operandi.
What I'm asking is, any other countries, have they used that modus operandi on Canadians that we've seen in the past, whether publicly aware or to this degree, which includes murder and extortion?
I would say not to that extent.
We'll start our third round now with Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Commissioner Duhem. Were any of the killers, the alleged killers of Mr. Nijar, known to the RCMP before the killings took place in that investigation?
The Nijar case right now is before the courts, and I'm not going to make any comments on the Nijar file as it's before the courts. Disclosure will happen in due course through the judicial process.
But it's been publicly reported that the four killers, we have Amandeep Singh, Karan Brar, Karanpreet Singh, Kamalpreet Singh, forgive me if the pronunciation's incorrect, these alleged killers were all temporary residents. Is that the case?
I would have to go back in my notes to confirm that these were all temporary residents. I couldn't answer.
Reported in the news. Can any of the other witnesses comment on that? This has been publicly reported in the Toronto Sun. Was nobody aware at our RCMP services that of any criminal background of these characters before they were allowed to come to Canada?
I'm not saying that no one is not aware. What I'm saying is the matter is before the courts, and I'm not going to comment on it.
Well, this has nothing to do with the current investigation, Commissioner, but it has a concern. It has a concern about whether or not our country is prepared to protect our national security. That's what we're talking about today. And if people with criminal backgrounds are coming to our country, being allowed to come to our country through the temporary resident program and possibly through the international student program, that's a serious breach of our national security. And that's our immigration system after 9 years of this Liberal government. In the case of Amandeep Singh, who has been accused of killing Mr. Najjar, were you aware that Amandeep Singh was on bail when the killing took place of Mr. Najjar?
Again, I'd have to go through my notes of the briefing because it happened quite some time ago, and a lot of things have happened since then.
Well, I guess I'll enlighten the committee. As was reported in the Toronto Sun, there was a March 2023 warrant for fleeing police and the dangerous operation of a motor vehicle in Surrey, BC last November. He was pinched on firearms and drug charges in Brampton. He was out on bail at the time of the Peel Region incident. He agreed in Surrey that he wouldn't possess firearms or ammo or get behind the wheel of the car. He made his first court appearance in June 16th of 2023. 2 days later, this is according to the Toronto Sun, Sikh Canadian activist Hardeep Singh Najjar was killed. Why are these dangerous criminals who are here as temporary residents, possibly here as international students, I don't know what educational institution they're attending, why are they allowed to be out on bail? This is like, if we're watching these people, we know they're a threat to national security. Why are they here? Why are they allowed to be out on bail? Why are they allowed to walk Canadian streets?
Chair, the answer to that, I think one is the process of providing them visas or access to entry into Canada. It's best to be posed to IRCC. And if people are released on bail before the courts, that's got nothing to do with the RCMP. It's a judicial process that we operate within.
I think Canadians will be somewhat concerned. We have, many of the lead figures from our national security establishment, and there doesn't appear to be any sort of coordination between Immigration Canada, between our security services, and I'm not getting a lot of confidence today that our national security is being protected in this country under this government when it appears that our immigration system has been compromised in this case, when it appears that our justice system is being compromised, and these accused killers are being allowed to walk on the street and go after Canadian citizens, particularly Canadian citizens of Sikh background. I think that's deeply concerning to me, and I think that should be a major focus of what this investigation is. What processes did our country have that could have prevented this? Yes, we can talk about briefing foreign media outlets in order to get this information out. We can talk about the fact that the Prime Minister had information on this, but if we're not fixing our systems like our immigration system and our justice system, it's going to allow these very dangerous criminals to walk on our street. How long have you been investigating, Commissioner Duhem, how long have you been investigating Indian foreign interference on Canadian soil?
I wouldn't be able to provide the committee with an exact date.
It just seems to me that this has become an issue very recently, and I suspect it has been a long time issue, but it really seems to have come to a boil in the last few years. Can you tell this committee maybe why this has become an issue in the last few years? It seems to have become a big issue.
Whole question, I would take you back when the director of CSIS, former director David Vigneault, brought to the forefront the immediate risk to Canadians with the ideological motivated violent extremists. that was pretty new to us because it wasn't on the radar. And I would say foreign interference, although it was probably happening way before it came to the forefront like it is right now, but I think it's a phenomenon that we've learned over the years, and it's present more now than what we've seen before because there's probably more intelligence and work being done.
And I'm not saying that this has never been an issue and that it only became an issue recently. This has obviously been a serious issue, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ms. Drouin, you looked like you wanted to say something to the previous question, and I just wondered if you could respond, please.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I just want to say that we take the immigration security screening very seriously. It's a process that involves IRCC, CBSA, CSIS, RCMP. Yes, as any other field, always room for improvement, but it is not something that we are not taking, as I said, seriously. I need also to say that we cannot take for granted that those individuals came to Canada with criminal backgrounds. Maybe it is sometimes the situation, but we cannot take for granted that it is always the situation. And, doing a good screening also involves having a very good partnership and relation with the country of origin, as we need to also rely on their own information. So those are the information that I want, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
We go now to Mr. Motz for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for being here, witnesses. And Commissioner, I specifically want to thank you for the work that you and your members have done on this file. That you didn't give it up 11 months ago and longer. And thank you for the work that you've done and bringing this as far as you have, and I wish you the best in continuing to work on it. I do have a question. When you're dealing with sensitive national security information, not necessarily you, Commissioner, maybe this is more to Mr. Drouin, when you're dealing with sensitive national security information, who can declassify that? Who has the authority to do that?
The owner of the intelligence products. So, for example, let's say you have something that have been published or released.
That's the standard in the intel world. The owner can release it. Now, you are a consumer of that. You don't create your own intel. As the national security intelligence advisor to the PM, you're the consumer of intelligence, right?
Right.
So, who did you get to authorize the release? You don't call it sensitive information or it was classified, but I read the National Post article. I'm telling you what. That's pretty sensitive information, pretty classified information. So someone above you, who the owner of that intel had to give you authority to release that to the Washington Post, did you not?
So as I said many times, we have not shared classified information with the journalists. Maybe I can add that what we discussed with the journalists was exactly what we told all your leaders when we briefed your leaders.
Right. Including Mr. Poilievre.
Including Mr. Poilievre.
Thank you. And again, I don't want to play semantics, but I would consider some of the information that you told was not made public, would not normally have been made public under different circumstances. Commissioner Duhaime has made that very, very clear. It could impact the criminal investigation and jeopardize the lives of many individuals. Commissioner, you stated very recently, I don't know the exact time, but within the last week or so, that you would have concerns if the 6 diplomats were to be replaced. Does that remain your position?
My comment was that I do have concerns considering how the government of India operates. But I also shared in that same interview that I'm not familiar with the background process that's in place when a diplomat or a consular official is appointed to a country. So perhaps Mr. Morrison would be better placed to explain on the security side or checks.
I was just going to ask Mr. Morrison, do you share those same concerns, and what does that look like for global affairs?
We will continue to let the dust settle. And then there's a lot of dust, and then we will work with our counterparts to ensure that both sides have adequate representation in each other's countries. There's a process of screening where when a country applies to accredit its diplomats, we work as Global Affairs Canada with the security agencies to ensure there's no adverse information. And assuming that's the case, then we accredit new diplomats.
Thank you. And quickly, Commissioner, you had mentioned here just a couple minutes ago about it's reasonable to assume, in fact, it's occurring, that India also experiences violent extremism, differently than we do here. You indicated that that's a reality. Now, is it possible that criminals from Canada are giving direction to operas in India, just like it's alleged to be vice versa to Canada?
I mean, after coming out on October 14th, anything's possible. We can't discount that, but that's the importance of working with our colleagues in India so we can work together and address the people who are involved.
Thank you. 5 minutes.
So much. Okay, we go now to Ms. O'Connell.
Quite concerned, and following on my colleague Mr. Sarai's comments, we're here at about just over an hour and a half into testimony, about 5 rounds of questions for the Conservatives. I think at least 3 of those rounds were focused on information that was done on background to the media that have confirmed that that information was not classified by the sheer fact that their own leader received the same information, and we all know he doesn't have a security clearance. So information that was provided by all leaders was also provided to the media, and Conservatives have spent at least 3 of their rounds on that issue. My colleague Mr. Gahir spoke about the reference to a Bollywood plot, but the idea that perhaps the Indian government was using organized criminals within their country, within even their own criminal justice systems, Canada would not have been able to reach in and, let's say, arrest that individual to disrupt that. So it was part of the reason for coming forward publicly was to disrupt these sorts of serious allegations and actions in areas that the police in Canada could not just in a traditional sense go and follow where the investigation leads and go pick up an individual or a criminal that may not be within our borders.
Quick answer, please.
Priority for us was public safety.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. We'll start our 4th round now with Mr. Shipley. 5 minutes, please.
5, 6, 9 times. My friend was keeping track in her opening question, so I think the people who are being overly partisan are perhaps on the other side of the table today. But anyways, we've got a serious issue ahead of us. They can smirk, they can laugh, but let's get into some of the questions here. First to Mr. Morrison and Mr. Uan. An NSCOP report from 2019 stated that CSIS observed an increase in Indian threat-related activity targeting the Indo-Canadian, diaspora and government institutions. This same NSCOP report found that Indian consular officials were maintaining blacklists of dissidents, controlling travel visas to India, and recruiting community sources that were engaging MPs and political candidates to advance Indian objectives. Given that each of your organizations presumably read this report at the time and knew about these activities dating back to at least 2019, which very clearly fall outside of the norm of diplomatic activity, why did the government wait until these threats had escalated to the point of violence and murder to expel any consular officials?
I think as Natalie said and has been testified to today, the various parts of the government have been live to the issue of foreign interference for a number of years and have been taking all kinds of measures when the situation reached its apex, as has been described, and as the RCMP has said, when they came to us and sought our help, we then used one of our heaviest diplomatic tools, which was the persona non grata tool. But I wouldn't assume that Indian foreign interference was not a constant subject of discussion throughout that time period, 2019 until the present, in all of our interactions with India.
Mr. Would you like to?
L'Inde est aussi.
India is also a priority for the work of the service. So when it comes to the resources we deploy to identify various strategies by India, that's one of the countries we concentrate on more.
To Mr. Duham, thank you for being here today. Through a lot of the reports we've read and a lot of the indications that a lot of this crime that we're talking about is going on here is being funneled through organized crime groups that are here in Canada. What have we done, or what have you done, or what have your group or the government done to disrupt the communication lines between organized crime groups and the Indian government to ensure this doesn't continue?
Well, the fact, Mr. Chair, that we came out publicly, that was one of the strategies we had to ensure that the message is out and that the community is aware and the community will report it, making sure that people from the community do not fall victims to influence and whatnot. And it's continuing to work with our government departments as to maintaining not oversight but a view of what's going on in Canada with regards to Government of India's influence and criminal activities in Canada.
Thank you for that. And I have a quick question. I've really been intrigued today by Mr. Morrison and Mr. Nguyen. I'm going to quote your words back to both you. You have both said that you've decided to go to the Washington Post to make sure you went to a respected and credible newspaper. By that, do you feel there are no respected or credible newspapers in Canada?
Go back to, I think we said international outlet, sir. And this is a very
you did
important.
say you wanted to go to a respected and credible news source, and you used the Washington Post.
International. I think I explained that, and that has nothing to do, quite the contrary. And I also said in my opening remarks that the pretension of India are not right, but they pretend that our India file is politically motivated, and that our media are into that scheme too. So this is why we use an international outlet, because we knew that those allegations from India would resurface. So that was the nexus and the reason to go with an international outlet.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We'll go now to Mr. Dollarwell for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, over the past, many weeks, my constituents have come to me, and in fact, they have appreciated the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and also thanked the RCMP, Commissioner Duham, and also Mr. Rogers, the work that CISA has done, and community feels at ease. But on the other hand, they keep on complaining to me about the Conservatives and their leader, particularly when even today I can see their line of questioning is not focusing on the perpetrators of crime, which is agents of India. In fact, is questioning you and all those media things. I'm coming back to Mr. Rogers here. I just need more clarification. Just to clarify an earlier point, that would the leader of the opposition still need a security clearance in order to read the NSI COP report and to learn about his own leadership race, because a lot of allegations coming that agents of India were involved to install him as a leader of the Conservative Party. Would he need a security clearance to know all that? And if you can elaborate that, please.
Apologies. Thank you for the question. I have to refrain from speaking to the specifics of any intelligence, so I have to go back to what I've said before, which is that we will be able to describe more and broader sets of intelligence to people with a security clearance. In cases where that clearance is not available, we will look at the other mechanisms available to us, which might include things like threat reduction measures, or other types of information briefings, defensive briefings, or other briefings to help reduce the threat. That would apply with any opposition leader or any Canadian.
Ms. Dancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. It is quite the panel that we have, the Commissioner of the RCMP, the National Security Advisor, the Director of CSIS, and 2 top-level Deputy Ministers for Public Safety and Global Affairs. I appreciate your time very much and your commitment to national security in this country. I have no doubt that you all work extremely hard to keep Canadians safe. And ultimately, of course, you all answer to the Prime Minister in some way or another. He is the head of our government. And you'll recall certainly in the 2015 when Mr. Trudeau first became Prime Minister, they released, a document was released called Open and Accountable Government. I'm sure you're all familiar. It mentions in there that as the head of government, the Prime Minister has special responsibility for national security, federal, provincial, territorial relations, and the conduct of international affairs. Do you all agree that he is the head of our national security apparatus, the Prime Minister? Does anyone disagree with that? No. So the responsibility ultimately ends with him, as you have agreed. And we are in a circumstance here where multiple individuals, one for sure, and perhaps others, according to the Washington Post article, have been murdered through direct ties to the government of India. Quite an extraordinary situation on our hands. We also have a situation where we have a foreign interference inquiry with Justice Hogue, where the real center of that is that China has been interfering in multiple elections, looking to undermine our democracy. We have misinformation en masse from Russia. We have issues from Iran. We have issues from Pakistan, others. Canada, from my understanding, has never quite been in this type of, we'll call it a pickle, to put it blunt, to put it lightly, where so many adversaries and others who we thought were certainly friends are coming at Canada from all angles. Is there any other time in history you can point to Canada facing this many threats in this way domestically from foreign actors? Is there any other time in the last 2 generations, for example?
Si vous me permettez, peut-être ce que je peux dire, c'est que il est vrai.
What I could say is that it's true we have to take seriously any attempt at foreign interference. I think that some of us here stated that during the last election, elections were fair and were not marked by the consequences of foreign interference. As parliamentarians, you adopted Bill C-170.
But that wasn't specifically my question. I do appreciate your commentary in response to my commentary, but that was not directly answering my question. But I'll just put that aside for now. As actually our colleague from the NDP mentioned, the NCCOP report labeled Canada a low-risk, high-reward for foreign adversaries, in essence, to come to Canada and wreak havoc and cause a lot of crime and chaos and even death now from India, for example, as you've mentioned. And so my concern is that the leadership from the top, given the only individual ultimately responsible for national security, and we have death on our hands. We had 13 more individuals in peril. From an objective analysis, things are not going that well in Canada. I appreciate there's things that you've done that we'll never know, but we should be grateful for. I appreciate that very much. But the fact that there's individuals being murdered in Canada is beyond comprehension from a foreign government. I'm sure you would agree. From our perspective as the official opposition tasked with holding the Liberal government accountable, this is an abject failure to maintain national security. The fact that individuals have been murdered, the fact that there are communities in this country, the Sikh community, for example, that have felt incredibly vulnerable under the so-called leadership of the current Prime Minister. So I think that really is the reason we are here is because he has failed to maintain national security. The reason we have the national inquiry into foreign interference is because there's been a failure to maintain the integrity of our democracy in terms of its attacks from China. And the confidence that creates, the confidence issue that creates across Canada is deeply concerning in the message that sends to other adversaries that they could take advantage of our democratic process and our trusting nature. So I think that really needs to be underlined in the sense that you can only do what your limitations are, what the leadership of this country are. So I just wanted to underline that because I feel that there seems to be an obsession with members opposite with the opposition leader, when I wish that the Liberal members would apply that same energy to holding their own Prime Minister accountable for failing to stop the murders of a number of people in Canada from a foreign government, for failing to stop interference into our elections. That's really quite a frustrating matter that has happened under their watch as they've been part of the Liberal government. And so, Mr. Chair, I just conclude that, again, I thank you for your efforts, and I appreciate very much what you've done to protect Canadians and to fill the gaps for the lack of leadership from our Prime Minister to do so. Thank you.